Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
There is something very strange about the way many believers defend the religious stories they grew up with. They treat them as if they are deep truths that cannot be questioned, even when those stories collapse the moment we apply normal thinking to them. The surprising thing is that most of these stories sound exactly like the tales children invent in school playgrounds. They are filled with magic, no explanations, no evidence, and no consistency. Yet adults defend them with full passion and even try to build moral systems and entire lifestyles upon them. When you look at these stories calmly, without fear, without emotional pressure, and without years of religious conditioning, they start looking like simple folk tales created in a world with no science, no literacy, and no way to test claims. One of the strangest things is how people argue about these stories as if they are facts of history. Take the idea that a talking snake convinced the first humans to eat a forbidden fruit. If any child today says a talking animal convinced them to do something, adults will laugh or correct them. But when the same story appears in a scripture, suddenly it becomes untouchable. You are told that this talking snake was not a normal snake, it was a supernatural one. So the snake can talk, but only because the story requires it. The truth is simple. People in ancient times did not know anything about evolution, brain anatomy, or biology. They did not understand language development or animal behavior. They lived in a world where magical creatures seemed possible because they had no better explanation. Today we have entire scientific fields that can explain how life works. Yet people still defend the idea of a talking snake. Not because it makes sense, but because they are emotionally attached to the story. Then there is the story of a worldwide flood that covered every mountain. People argue about it as if it is a real event. They say one family collected every animal on Earth and put them on one wooden boat. The moment you think about it for even a minute, everything breaks down. How did they collect millions of species that live on different continents? How did they feed them, clean them, and keep them alive? How did animals that need cold weather survive next to animals that need hot weather? How did saltwater fish survive when the oceans mixed with rainwater? And if the flood destroyed everything, why do we still have civilizations that recorded their own uninterrupted history across that same time period? Ancient Egyptian records continue without any global destruction. Chinese records do the same. There is not a single layer of global flood sediments around the world. Yet people still argue that the story is historically true. Not because evidence supports it, but because they were raised to believe it. If you replace the characters with random villagers from a storybook, religious people would immediately call it a myth. But when the myth comes from their own book, they treat it differently. Another strange story that believers argue about is the idea that a man lived inside a giant fish for days and then came out alive. In the real world, when someone drowns or loses oxygen even for a few minutes, brain damage occurs. No stomach of any fish provides oxygen. No stomach provides space. The acids inside would melt flesh within hours. But when a religious story requires a man to survive inside a fish, suddenly all the laws of nature disappear. People say that a miracle made it possible. The word miracle becomes a magic ticket that removes the need for logic. If anyone today claimed that their uncle survived inside a shark for 3 days, no one would believe them. But when it is written in an ancient book, people say it is true without question. One more story is about the sun stopping in the sky so an army could win a battle. Modern believers who defend this story forget something very simple. Our planet rotates. If the sun stopped in the sky, that would mean the Earth stopped rotating. If the Earth suddenly stopped spinning, everyone and everything would be thrown with massive force due to inertia. Every mountain would collapse. Every ocean would leave its basin. The entire planet would be destroyed. Yet people argue that the sun paused in the sky and nothing else happened. They say it was a miracle and we should accept it. But if someone told you today that during a war, the sun waited so a village could win a fight, you would think they are joking or mentally confused. The only reason people defend these stories is because they grew up hearing them as sacred. Another story is that a man was taken up to the sky on a winged creature. Believers argue that this is a real historical event. They say he traveled through 7 layers of heaven in a single night. When you ask how he breathed in space where there is no air, they say he was protected. When you ask how he did not freeze in the cold of the upper atmosphere, they say it was a miracle. When you ask why no one else saw him, they say only special people were allowed to know. The moment you try to understand the story with normal logic, it falls apart completely. Yet millions argue passionately that it is a real event. The question is why? The answer is fear of questioning, cultural conditioning, and emotional loyalty to a story told since childhood. Some believers argue that angels record every human action, but angels are invisible, and no one has ever recorded even one piece of evidence for their existence. It is basically the ancient version of a surveillance system invented by humans before cameras existed. People needed a way to scare others into good behavior, so they invented the idea that someone is always watching. Today we have actual CCTV cameras. We know how monitoring works. But believers still argue that invisible creatures record your every move on invisible tablets. They defend this strongly, not because there is any proof, but because the idea served a purpose in ancient societies that wanted control over people. There are also stories about prophets doing strange things that serve no moral purpose. Turning sticks into snakes, splitting seas, and curing diseases by touch. If any person today said they can cure blindness by spitting on mud and putting it on someone's eyes, they would be ignored or arrested. Hospitals require years of research, testing, and expertise. Modern medicine has saved millions of lives through science and evidence. But in religious stories, healing happens instantly, without explanation, without procedure, and without any permanent proof. Believers argue that these miracles happened, yet none of them happen now when we have cameras and phones that can record everything. Not a single prophet-level miracle appears in the modern world. And when someone dares to ask why, people respond with excuses instead of answers. There are also stories where God sends bears to kill children because those children laughed at a prophet. Believers defend this by saying the children were disrespectful. But in the real world, even cruel dictators do not send wild animals to kill kids for mocking someone. No normal adult would ever think that is justice. Yet the story is treated as divine judgment. When you calmly think about it, the story sounds like something told by a harsh tribal leader who needed fear, not a description of a wise and moral universe. Another example is the story that demons cause mental illness. In ancient times, people did not know about the brain, neurons, or psychology, so they blamed unseen creatures for every disorder. Today we have entire medical fields that understand depression, schizophrenia, trauma, and anxiety. But religious people still argue that invisible creatures take control of humans. They defend this idea even though modern medicine has shown again and again that mental disorders come from brain chemistry, trauma, and genetics, not demons. When someone behaves strangely today, we do not perform exorcisms. We take them to doctors and therapists. The idea that demons whisper sinful thoughts into your mind is just a way ancient people explained their own emotions and fears. Yet believers still argue that it is true. The list continues with the idea that a virgin gave birth without any biological process. In the real world, reproduction requires genetic material from two people. Every living species follows biological laws. But when a religious story needs a miracle child, suddenly all biological rules disappear. People argue for this story without thinking that if such an event were real, scientists today would study it as the most important biological discovery ever. There would be medical reports, genetic studies, and endless examinations. But in religious texts, it simply happens with no explanation. The story survives not because it is logical, but because people were trained to believe it. Another commonly defended religious idea is the sacrifice of animals to please God. In the past, people believed that the smell of burnt animals rises to heaven and pleases divine beings. Today we understand that smell is a chemical reaction, and it certainly does not travel into a spiritual world. But people still argue that slaughtering animals is a divine command. When you see blood spilling on the ground, it is obvious that this is a tradition created by ancient humans who lived in a world filled with sacrifice rituals. They had no refrigeration, no supermarkets, and no knowledge of biology. Yet believers defend this as if the universe needs the smell of burnt meat to stay happy. The argument makes no sense in a world where we understand chemistry and physics. Many believers also defend the story that humans once lived for hundreds of years. They argue that early prophets lived for 800 or 900 years, even though modern biology shows the opposite. Every species has a maximum lifespan based on cellular processes. Humans face aging due to cell division limits, DNA damage, and immune system decline. Our bodies simply cannot last centuries. There is no evidence in fossils, no evidence in ancient records, and no evidence in genetics that humans ever lived anywhere close to that long. Yet believers defend this idea as if it is normal. They say people in the past had better purity, better diets, or better environments. But even the healthiest modern humans who have access to medicine, clean water, advanced healthcare, and controlled diets still age naturally and die within the same biological limits. Another idea believers argue for is the concept that a divine being created a man from clay and a woman from a rib. Clay cannot magically turn into a fully functioning organism. Clay has no DNA, no cell structure, no metabolism, no nervous system. It is simple earth. Even a simple microscopic organism is more complex than any clay model. And the idea that a woman was made from a rib ignores everything we know about biology, embryology, and genetics. Believers also argue for the story that all languages in the world came from one event where humans tried to build a tall tower to reach heaven. They say that God became angry and scattered their languages so they could no longer communicate. Today we have an entire field called linguistics that studies how languages evolve gradually over long periods of time. Languages change through interaction, migration, and social development, not because of sudden supernatural punishment. The idea that people built a tower high enough to threaten heaven makes no sense because heaven was believed to be physically above the sky back then. People did not know about space, planets, or the structure of the universe. They believed heaven was a ceiling above the clouds, so when the story was written, it felt believable. Today we know that no tower can reach space, and even if you try, you face lack of oxygen, freezing temperatures, and gravitational limitations. Another story that people argue about is that diseases were caused by divine punishment. Earthquakes, storms, and plagues were seen as signs of anger from above. Today we have meteorology for storms, geology for earthquakes, and microbiology for diseases. We know that viruses spread through contact, not through sin. We know that tectonic plates cause earthquakes, not human behavior. Yet religious communities still argue that disasters happen because of moral failure. When a city is hit by a storm, some believers say it is a warning from God. But storms hit innocent people, including babies, animals, and entire ecosystems. Storms do not follow moral rules. They follow natural patterns. If disasters were moral punishment, then places with the highest suffering would also have the worst behaviors. And that is not true at all. Many of the safest and most successful places in the world have people of diverse beliefs. Another story that people defend strongly is that their holy book is perfect and contains no errors. They argue this even when the book contains contradictions, unclear passages, and outdated rules. If a modern writer produced a book with unclear sentences, repeated stories, and contradictory claims, readers would criticize it. They would ask for edits, clarification, and corrections. But when a religious book contains the same issues, people defend it. They say the contradiction is only in our misunderstanding. They say odd rules made sense in ancient times, so they remain holy forever. They say flawed descriptions of nature are symbolic, not literal. They bend every interpretation to protect the book. They do not apply the same standards to any other text on earth. This shows that the defense comes from loyalty, not from evidence or logic. Many believers also argue that the world is only a few thousand years old. They defend this strongly even though we have fossils that are millions of years old. We have rocks that are billions of years old. We have cosmic light that has traveled across the universe for billions of years. We have archaeological sites older than the age believers claim for the world itself. Yet they defend the young world idea because their text says so. They will say that fossils were placed there as a test, or that scientists are wrong. But these arguments collapse once you understand how independent fields of science all agree on the same timeline. Geology, astronomy, paleontology, and physics all confirm an ancient universe. They are not connected by any agenda. They simply follow evidence. Then there is the idea that prayer can change outcomes in a supernatural way. Believers argue that if you pray with sincerity, events will shift to match your request. But millions of people pray every day, and life continues exactly according to natural causes. People in hospitals pray for healing, but medical treatment decides survival. Students pray before exams, but studying decides performance. People pray for rain, but weather patterns decide when clouds form. Every field that can be measured shows the same thing. Prayer does not change reality. It helps the individual feel calm, but the actual outcome comes from real-world causes. If prayer changed events, hospitals would collect prayer reports, governments would use prayer instead of planning, and disasters would be avoided simply by asking. Believers also argue that everything good that happens is a blessing, and everything bad that happens is a test. This creates a system where nothing can ever challenge the belief. If something positive happens, they say God rewarded them. If something terrible happens, they say God tested them. If a believer survives a disaster, they say it was divine protection. If a believer dies in the disaster, they say it was divine plan. This circular reasoning means the claim can never be proven wrong. It is a mental shield that protects belief from evidence. In everyday life, if a friend explains everything with circular reasoning, you would question their thinking. But when religion does it, people accept it without hesitation. Another issue is the story that animals were created for humans. Believers argue that animals exist only to serve us. But the natural world is far more complex. Animals existed for millions of years before humans. Dinosaurs lived long before any human walked the earth. Ecosystems function in a delicate balance where every species plays a role. Plants, insects, and animals evolve through natural selection, not for human benefit. If the world was created for humans, then why do deadly creatures exist? Why do some animals live in deep oceans where humans cannot reach? Why do parasites exist that harm children and animals? These questions show that the world is not designed for humans. Believers also argue for the idea that morality comes only from religion. But humans across the world, including non-religious societies, develop moral systems based on empathy, cooperation, and shared benefit. Children show moral behavior long before they learn about religion. Animals also show cooperation, fairness, and compassion. Morality comes from social evolution and emotional development, not from ancient books. Yet many believers insist that without religion, humans cannot be moral. This is simply not supported by history or psychology. The idea survives because it gives religion a sense of authority. Another story believers defend is that evil in the world exists because humans disobeyed God. But many forms of suffering have nothing to do with human actions. Babies are born with illnesses. Animals suffer in nature. Storms destroy homes. Earthquakes kill thousands. Diseases spread randomly. None of these events require human sin. They come from natural causes. So believers argue that suffering exists to teach lessons or build character. But natural disasters do not target moral lessons. They hit everyone without discrimination. One of the strongest reasons these stories survive is cultural pressure. Many people accept them because everyone around them accepts them. Questioning religious stories can bring social conflict. Families may react with anger. Communities may judge the person. So people continue defending stories they have never deeply examined. They repeat arguments they heard from others, not arguments they thought through themselves. When someone grows up hearing these stories in a sacred tone, the stories become part of identity, not part of logic. And once something becomes part of identity, defending it becomes emotional, not rational. Another reason these stories survive is fear. People fear punishment, fear death, fear uncertainty. Religious stories provide easy answers to complex questions. Even when the stories make little sense, the comfort they offer feels valuable. So believers argue for them passionately, even when evidence contradicts them. In the end, when we take a calm and honest look at these stories, we see that they come from a time when humans were trying their best to explain a world they did not understand. They created stories about talking animals, magical healings, giant floods, supernatural creatures, and divine punishments, because they had no scientific tools to investigate the world. The stories are interesting as mythology, but they do not match reality. People argue for them today not because the stories are strong, but because belief has been passed down for generations. Once you step outside the emotional frame and look at the stories like any other human tale, the flaws become clear. They resemble ancient attempts to make sense of nature, not accurate descriptions of reality.